Thank you for joining us today for the latest in a series of presentations brought to you by IDEAL. My name is Paul Jenkins, University Librarian and Principal Investigator of the IDEAL Grant, sponsored by the Davis Foundation. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Anthony DeAnda. Mike is a professional lecturer in the College of Computing and Digital Media at DePaul University. He earned his PhD in Technology and Humanities at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Mike's topic today is complicating the discourse of representation in gaming. Please help me in welcoming him to Franklin Pierce. Yay, everybody applauds. Woo-hoo.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me go ahead and start sharing.
I see it.
Great. As Paul said, the topic for my discussion today, I'll be focusing on the discourse of representation in games. And I'd like to start by thanking Paul for inviting me to participate as one of the lecturers in this series, and to Andrew and Corey for helping me troubleshoot and set up technology through this process. Paul gave me a rather nice introduction. And I'd like to just add that my particular research interests focus on experimental game design in looking at the way that we can actually complicate and redefine gender and sexuality as they are performed and as they are understood in society. I'm also interested in queer world building, and as I'm moving forward in my research, I'm looking at how games history, HIV activism, and LGBTQ activism intertwine specifically. So today I'll be talking about representation, and to start off with, I'm going to present one instance of kind of modern or present day example of games and representation, and frame it through what I'm going to refer to as the ludology-narratology rift in game studies. And I'm going to observe how this rift actually mirrors gaming culture. Following, I'm going to talk about game mechanics and procedural rhetoric as a way of complicating the way that representation, particularly of underrepresented bodies, needs to be reconsidered in the discourse of games. Then I will speak about representation itself, thinking about how it's more than just visual representation or narratological representation, and thinking about it through systems and mapping that onto games. And finally, I'll use Sean Wajibi's The Longest Couch, a small game, to map my proposal of a way for thinking about representation in games. So to start off my talk, I'd like to point our attention to the introduction of video games into the GLAAD, formerly known as the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, into their media awards for outstanding representations of LGBTQ stories in media. Through this award specifically, GLAAD is, quote, committed to ensuring the authentic LGBTQ stories are included into video games, end quote. Titles nominated for this award, the first ever award was proposed in 2018. So titles nominated for this award include Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Elder Scrolls Online, Somerset, Guild of Wars 2, Path of Fire, Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, and The Sims Mobile. So a couple things stand out about this sample of games. The first is that they're all AAA games, games made for large audiences, or sorry, games made for mass distribution, usually by large teams of people in production studios. And the second is that most of them include interacting with LGBTQ characters as an option. So both of these issues point to discoursive representation in video games. Responding to the first, focusing solely on AAA titles misses much of the rich developments and explorations of games as a medium from indie developers, especially those who are LGBTQ and sharing stories from their own lived experiences. And for a sample of these, I recommend checking out the Cranerson Games Conference archives, as well as the different games previous archives as well. And this speaks to larger issues of imagined audiences, who are often imagined as young, cisgender, heterosexual, white men that the AAA studios, such as Nintendo, Blizzard, and Electronic Arts, make this their imagined audiences for their markets. And treating LGBTQ representation as an option is a way for these development companies to appear socially conscious, but in turn serve to situate these narratives as, quote, sites for the consumption of worlds that privilege the American empire, militarism, and white heroes, end quote, from Kishana Gray and David Leonard's book, Woke Gaming. Though it is not imperative for players to encounter the diversity offered in these games. So while this award claims to honor games that authentically portray LGBTQ stories, it highlights games that continue treating LGBTQ identities specifically and diversity broadly as an add and stir practice. In essence, the award privileges the narratological components of games, emphasizing the possibility of encountering LGBTQ stories, simultaneously silos this representation to potential narratives encountered in games. A second example that I want to draw our attention to is the avatar customization features that appear in most games. Shown here is the one used in Pokemon Sword and Shield. This game requires players to choose one of 8 avatar appearances, indicating a change of gender, skin tone, and hair color. Of these, hair color is the only one that can be changed later in the game. The constraints imposed upon players invoke a gender binary. You can play as a boy or a girl. And the choice of avatar has no impact on gameplay, but to conflate this with racial representation is fraught. This, as Jennifer Malkowski and Treyandria Russworm discuss, underscore frames of representation through neoliberal ideology. It's there for players to use, and it's up for players to do so. Furthermore, this distances skin color from how race operates through socio-political and cultural apparatuses, problematically reducing race in video games to hex codes. So GLAAD's Outstanding Video Game Award and the Avatar Customizer in Pokemon Sword and Shield are 2 examples that highlight how the discourse of representation in games neglect play itself. And in this presentation, I argue that representation in games necessarily needs to integrate play and materiality into current and future conversations, as opposed to solely focusing on aesthetics and narrative when we talk about diversity and when we talk about representation and when we talk about representation of diversity specifically. And through this discussion, I emphasize how subcultural competencies speak to digital literacy in order to render diversity and inclusion legible. Sorry. Okay. So in game studies, scholars refer to an early point in game scholarship as the ludology versus narratology debate. And this is often simplified in ways that pit games as play and games as narrative against one another. And unsurprisingly, such binary thinking has created a polemic in game studies with lasting ramifications, and representation is only one of these. So this started in 1999 and Frasco Gonzalo is one person who contributed to this, who argued that while narrative is useful for studying video games, games require a unique approach to studying. His argument focuses, largely draws from Roger Calwau's early study of games through frameworks of ludus and paideia. Ludus being the more heavily rule-based play, like sports shown here, and paideia being more free-form and expressive play, shown by like playing dolls or playing dress-up, things like that. And so drawing from this framework, Gonzalo proposes that narrative plot operates similar to ludus and narrative setting operates similar to paideia in video games specifically, as a way of arguing how narratology can be used to study video games, but ultimately proposing that we need a type of ludology, a type of way of studying games specifically, as opposed to studying games as narrative or games as other types of media. And while he indicates that games and narrative share similarities, his study points out more of the differences. And later in 2001, Jesper Juul articulated that there exists an inherent conflict between interaction and narrative, and therefore there is a difference between games and narratives themselves. And so we see this divide happening at an early point in game studies, and it has had lasting ramifications, not only in game studies, but in gaming culture. We see this reflected in gaming culture as well. As I am going to talk more today, representation, specifically about diversity, is one of the ways that this rift has had lasting effects. But a way that we can see this reflected in gaming culture is through the hardcore versus casual games and gamer divide, where games are often gate-kept if they are too simple, and the term gamer is itself a packed term filled with, or a packed term that's gate-kept. And Anastasia Salter, Bridget Blodgett, Carly Kussar, Jennifer DeWinter, Adrian Massanari, Adrian Shaw, and Bonnie Ruberg are several of the many scholars who have studied how this type of framework, from this type of framework, toxic gatekeeping and toxic behaviors in gaming culture emerge. So it's not surprising that the argument of what counts as a game and who has access to the label of gamer deploys this divide as a way of excluding game designers and players, often from underrepresented backgrounds, specifically women and LGBTQ people. And so in a broader context of representation in games, this is also an issue of whose histories, labor, and play experience is recognized and celebrated within gaming culture itself. An issue that could be its own presentation. Today, I want to focus specifically on how it operates through the games as cultural artifacts. So these are only a couple examples of how the rifts between the ludic and narrative or aesthetic components of games have shaped the discourse of representation in games. Particularly regarding diversity. And in rethinking how we might reunite these components, I turn to studying game mechanics. Amanda Phillips has previously called for studying how we play and act upon bodies in games, particularly Black bodies. And drawing from this thread, I want to further identify the role of gaming structures and representation of identities. So game mechanics are a central part to my intervention of the discourse of representation in games. The simplest games often have mechanics that require complex thinking to understand how players engage with the systems and how the games require player to posture their bodies in different configurations as determined by how they play. So we can think about this if you're playing Super Mario, or if you're familiar with Super Mario, that the base mechanic is running and jumping, and this gets scaffolded through gameplay in different ways, so that you are, in a sense, learning to complete different challenges or different puzzles through these two mechanics. And as you're playing, your body is also shifting the way that you move in response to what you're seeing from the game. So I wish to begin by discussing several definitions of game mechanics. And this points to an interesting part in game studies because the complexity of defining the game mechanic reflects the nuances in observing these components of games, and also points to issues about how we read games, and is thus relevant to the discussion of digital literacy. One of the issues is that several different people use different terms to kind of talk about the same thing. So Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman identify what they call the core mechanic as a foundation for creative activities that players enact during gameplay. And for Salen and Zimmerman, designers build upon the core mechanic in games to allow for different types of interactions in games. So my Super Mario example also exemplifies their definition of what a core mechanic is. Tracy Fullerton, in her textbook, Game Design Workshop, does not explicate a definition for game mechanics, assuming that the reader is already familiar with the concept. But she instead uses the term procedures to discuss the in-game actions players take in games as allowed by the rules. And so this is similar to other definitions for game mechanics and rules. So we're already seeing how different terminology is being deployed to talk about the same thing. Brenda Brathwaite and Ian Schreiber relay that game mechanic is another term for rule, highlighting how they will use these terms interchangeably in the textbook. Challenges for game designers. And for Brathwaite and Schreiber, mechanics are rules that act upon players, avatars, and game bits, game states and game views, and describe all the ways to change the game state. So for these two authors, game mechanics are not just about player choices, though these are a type of mechanic. They discuss mechanics as constraints and the possibility of available options to alter the current game state to another game state. Miguel Sicart attempts to formalize a definition for game mechanics that speaks to the processes of analyzing games and connecting these analyses to controller designs and user experience. He describes that the game mechanic serves as, quote, methods invoked by agents designed for interaction with the game state, end quote. And each of these words carefully selected. Methods highlights a verb or an action taken in games like running and jumping. Agents for Sicart include players, but also other in-game systems. And so these verbs are designed for interaction with game states, highlighting a constraint of which verbs are available to agents, but also keeping this definition open to different types of interactions in games. So while we might have access to a jump mechanic, we're able to, as players, use the jump mechanic without actually having to engage any of the other components in games. So in tension with Fullerton's description of game mechanics, Sicart highlights how these interactions aren't always directed towards achieving a goal in the game. And so Arkham Horror is a good example of Sicart's definition. This Eldritch horror tabletop role-playing game is played by players navigating the game board in an attempt to kill monsters, seal portals, and discover other types of clues. And then following a player's turn, the game rules include instructions for procedures for how monsters then move around the town, how portals are generated, and how certain shops close. And so to put simply, it's as if the game takes a turn. And yet this simplification also highlights how Seacart overprivileges the agency of the game. Basically, that games too have agency, which is a dangerous position that masks the labor of the game designer who designs these algorithms of play. Instead, Brenda Laurel's concept of whole actions better demonstrates how players and game designers work together even across time and space through the collaborative process of playing games. The constraints of the game systems and the game worlds are imposed by the game designers, and the game provides the space for players to later pick up and then contribute to the meaning-making process as they use and play the game and as they understand it. So the whole action is thus carried across, carried out as the player navigates and uses the system which the designer put in play. And Jesse Schell, while understanding that, quote, game mechanics are at the core of what a game truly is, end quote, attempts to tease apart game mechanics into 7 categories listed here. Space, time, objects, attributes, and states, actions, rules, skill, chance. And so diverging from previously discussed scholarship on mechanics that emphasize mechanics as actions or as verbs and choices taken by players, his definition includes nouns as well as verbs, which is important for thinking about the vocabulary that we invoke when we think about game mechanics. So overall, these scholars situate mechanics at the core of games, as Brathwaite and Schreiber say, the ingredients of games, or as Schell says, the nuts and bolts of games. And these definitions highlight attention to not only what can be done in games, but how these actions are limited, constrained, and denied by other components and procedures present in the games. And Ian Bogost coined the term procedural rhetoric in his argument for understanding how the procedural literacy of games, and in turn how game designers can create arguments about social systems through games. Importantly, he argues that the meaning making of games must be communicated through the processes of games, which has since publication been interpreted in game studies as the mechanics of games. So the argument or the meaning of a game, according to Bogost, must always be implemented through the game mechanics. Representation of social and cultural systems is at the heart of his theory. The games as systems of systems with imposed constraints and actions can be designed to make arguments about culture. And this procedural rhetoric provides a framework for understanding how game designers represent socio-political and cultural structures through their games. An assumption embedded in Bogost's theory is that he assumes that all players read systems the same way, and thus will deduce the same meaning from games. Mary Flanagan and Helen Niesenbaum highlight this point through several of their close readings of games. For example, in their reading of American football, they indicate that on the one hand, it might be read as a game about teamwork, dedication, and collaboration. And on the other hand, the values at play when playing football might be nationalism and aggression. And clearly, the focus on game mechanics for Bogost in his theory of procedural rhetoric stems from ludology and trying to make sense of the interactivity of games. um, presenting a method for creating arguments through heavily rule-bound play. So not only do we see how it stems from the ludology part of the rift, we also see how it comes from ludus, drawing back to Calvo's theory or initial structure. And yet representation here too often is concerned with socio-political systems as represented through the software specifically, and quickly gets dropped once studies start looking at bodies, especially bodies of avatars, to reflect underrepresented identities. And this can be particularly observed in how, this weirdly reflects how Seacart, among others, overemphasize non-human operators as agents in gaming, how they grant agency to non-human operators in gaming when these algorithms have been designed by game designers. And furthermore, the theory of procedural rhetoric does not account for the materiality of bodies and playthings. So scholars like Victoria Breger, Sam Tobin, and Chris Hansen have demonstrated how hardware also affects the game experience. Breger in particular has argued that actions in games are arbitrarily mapped onto game controllers. And yet these are important to take into consideration when we talk about representation because of the way that the player's body navigates these button inputs. So for example, if you've ever played a first-person shooter, when you're shooting the gun on screen, you're usually using the right trigger button. And this is trying to capture the feeling of pulling the trigger on a gun. So having provided a discussion about how game mechanics and meaning making in games has been theorized, I now want to discuss representation of underrepresented identities, considering how representation in game studies needs to attend to systems in play. So Malkowski and Rossworm in their collection, Gaming Representation, consider how representation itself is representative of its own processes and systems. Thus, games and representation share a deeper connection than is often understood. And they invoke Stuart Hall to articulate how culture operates as a set of processes through practices of encoding and decoding ideologies. And as I think about how digital literacy of games might render the processes and systems of systems legible through subcultural competencies, I'm drawn to Sarah Ahmed's theory of orientation in queer phenomenology. So Ahmed provides a useful lens to also map representation as a system of systems and constraints, relating sexual orientation to spatial orientation. She unpacks how certain identities are privileged and normalized as a result from having more accessible orientators. So this is an image of my hometown, El Paso, Texas. And one of the jokes that kind of circulates the local society is that anybody from El Paso or knows the landscape of El Paso should be able to navigate to any point in El Paso using the star on the mountain as one of their orientators. And the other previous one was the Asarco Tower, but that was torn down in 2013. But relating this to Ahmed's theory, this star serves as an orientator for us to find our way through the city. So this becomes a method for us to make sense of the space of the city itself and find our way. So Ahmed articulates how queerness stems from being disoriented in a space, and how queerness might also operate as a method for reorientating oneself in this space by developing a set of different orientators. This speaks to representation of diversity as people from underrepresented backgrounds also develop their own system of orientators to, as Ahmed says, find their way. Embedded in this process is a level of subcultural competencies through which communities of shared identities develop methods of understanding the systems and spaces they navigate, or to use Ahmed's terms, establish their own orientators. Thus, designs orientated or designs made for marginalized or underrepresented communities would necessarily attend to how these communities are not only orientated towards different objects, but how they find their way differently. Importantly, designs focus on representation need to consider not only how people are represented in larger systems, but also attend to the subcultural competencies of these people. The methods employed to navigate through disorientation in order to reorientate oneself, and how these shape their methods of navigating such systems. So the game mechanics should necessarily reflect these processes of disorientation and reorientation. So with all this, I now want to turn my focus to Sean Mujibi's game, The Longest Couch. And through my close play of the game, I will situate my argument for thinking about representation of underrepresented identities, in this case, gay people in games. And by situating my argument through this game, I demonstrate how representation conveyed in this game is intimately shaped by reorientating the orientation of players to the game, to the technology, and to each other. Focusing on a small game with low resolution art affords me the opportunity to emphasize representation through play and processes in the game, in addition to aesthetics and narrative. Sean Mujibi calls The Longest Couch, quote, a queer collaborative kissing game, end quote. This two-player game is played on one computer. In game, two boys sitting on a couch on opposite ends of a very long couch move closer as they navigate possible intimacies with each other. And this is a quick playthrough of the game. So as seen in the playthrough, key commands that map onto the keyboard appear above the characters' heads. When pressed, they make a sound. The sound design by Raghav Bashial seems like a conversation between characters and provides audible feedback to the players that they have pressed the keys. Excuse me. As players press the corresponding keys, the characters move closer and closer on the couch to each other. Once players have completed the string of key commands, those units disappear and are replaced with new key commands. As Whitney Powell argues, the longest couch presents queer technological intimacies through orientations and spatial dynamics. A series of coded button presses across a stretch of keyboard that translates to pulling closer of two boys on a couch. Drawing from Powell, I will underscore how these dynamics and orientations speak to queer representation through the process and play of the game. So as a two-player game on a single machine with one keyboard, players sit side by side, orientated towards the screen with their hands on the keyboards. At the beginning of the game, the players will begin with keys on opposite ends of the keyboard. One has arrow keys, and one has W, A, and S. So the hands of the players are separated by the distance of the keyboard, reflecting the on-screen boys separated by the long couch. As the game progresses, the key commands become closer and closer. When the boys are furthest on the couch, their key inputs operate as two units, indicated by lighter and darker circles up here on the key commands, which each player is charged with completing. But as they move together, the key commands become intertwined, so players now must negotiate the key presses with each other. So in contrast to this first one, the second one now has those two key commands integrated more. So the order is embedded into how these commands are delivered to players. So when these units are apart, we might imagine that that the characters on screen are trying to convince themselves to suss out whether or not they individually want to explore intimacy with the other. When the commands join, I read this as them having a conversation, especially as their sounds also now follow a back and forth. Like the on-screen counterparts, players are also engaging as they navigate the keyboard and press buttons. Many will probably recognize and can relate to the on-screen narrative of two people sitting on a couch timidly exploring intimacy, if not by experience, then in rom-coms often made for young adults. And sexual identity adds a layer onto this experience, where in addition to exploring intimacy, individuals are also wrestling with putting themselves in vulnerable situations of expressing their sexual orientation. So notice that when the key commands drop the enclosing circles, as seen here, when they drop the enclosing circles, the keys are now in different areas of the keyboards. So in this first command, the P and S are on one side, and then the L and C are here as well. And the two characters are now about close enough that they might actually be able to hold hands while sitting on the couch. Similarly, the sequences require more intimate engagement from players as their hands navigate the keyboards, bumping, touching, dancing around each other, and intertwining. When the key commands move closer, players must now navigate and hold down corresponding keys until they fulfill the indicated series of commands. So here, once you press the key, the command disappears. But once we get into this section, you must actually now press and hold the keys before you can move on. So ZKR for one player and EJS for the other indicate that players' hands and arms will be intertwined. If playing with one hand each, because the buttons must be held down, the players will be pretty much in a hand-holding configuration. If they are playing with both hands, their arms will likely be entangled as their fingers navigate which keys to hold down. Wajibi's game makes palpable how queer intimacy is represented through play and systems of processes. Here, players' orientation towards the screen moderates how they navigate the space of the keyboard. Though the game invites players to also experience the uncertainty and the vulnerability of being intimate with another person, something that under a system of heteronormativity might be a point of anxiety for a person with same gender attraction. And to invoke Ahmed, the game disorientates players from traditional understandings of games, uses of computers, and navigation of keyboards. So we often think that games serve a purpose. Wajibi's game is more expressive and more focused on this moment of intimacy, something that's not often seen as a goal or as a gaming experience. Furthermore, we have understandings of the way that we use keyboards and even the way that we play on keyboards. But this game even disorientates us from that and reorientates us into a different configuration of the game through play. And by situating this game in a particular moment, Wajibi focuses on the exploration of intimacy between two boys. And what's worth considering is that the representation is constrained to this moment. And that it is a small game, but it's still reflective of the experience of being vulnerable and potentially having to express one's own same-gender attraction. Whereas games mentioned earlier often focus on trying to capture a more authentic LGBTQ experience, whatever that might be, broadly, or it also points to the fact that games are always simulated or condensed versions of social systems. And therefore, it really is fraught that we think that a game can portray the entire experience of an underrepresented community. So some conclusions and ideas for further work. I would first like to begin with representation in games needs to account for how represented identities are engaged in play. So as shown in Wajibi's game, we get that level of queer intimacy and in not only what's shown on screen, but also how players are navigating the keyboard and developing a sense of intimacy with each other or engaging in or embodying this intimacy that's being shown to us on screen. But we also need to account for what other types of actions might be done to bodies on screen and whether or not these bodies shown to us have the options to react or if they remain playthings. We must further consider the lived experiences of underrepresented peoples and their meaning-making processes. So when designing characters based on people from underrepresented backgrounds, we necessarily need to take into account the way that they engage in world building and meaning-making processes. To draw from Ahmed, the way that they would find their own ways or find their ways. And future work should also attend to the labor of game developers and players beyond only focusing on representation on what's shown to us on screen. And like I said earlier, that could be its own presentation or paper on its own. So thank you. I'd like to now open the floor for questions.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so
Mike, I also, I just want to say I put some in the chat to him privately.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Mike, in the, it's taken a long time for all sorts of media to catch up with underrepresented groups. Is it safe to say that gaming mirrors that, or is even slower than, let's say, movies, novels, other art forms? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, and again, like that gets weird. Gaming, even though it is, and maybe perhaps because it is the at this moment number one source of entertainment, like it's outselling all other types of media. It's really struggling to be recognized as an art form or outside of this configuration of entertainment. And we see this argument invoked in very weird ways. One of my favorite ways is like, games are only art if they have the ability to make white men cry. But yes, like to answer your question, Frank asked a couple questions. So at this moment, I don't do faculty advising for gaming clubs. This is my first year at DePaul. I do have a two student project working kind of in my lab space, I guess you could say, in which we're designing a game to serve as an intervention for the way we navigate conversations of serostatus, HIV, your HIV status, and in order to potentially help reduce the stigma attached to HIV in society. And to answer your second question, do you engage undergraduates outside and inside the classroom on ludology and narratology? I make them aware of it. This isn't my preferred framework for game studies or for even game design. The game design department at DePaul is focused on practice of game design, but I'm actually not a fan of this rift happening, and I think it needs to be synthesized. And I think that really starts with teaching students how to look at games not only as narrative or as play and procedures, but how these two are operating together.
Question. Am I on?
Yes. We can hear you, Phyllis.
I teach two classes where I think this relates. One is media criticism, and I do a unit on narrative theory. And another is gender and media representation. And so I just, in narrative theory, it's been studied early on, goes back into anthropology and studying, storytelling and then ritual. So one is story, one is narrative, and then the other is play. And I just wonder, just what you think about whether when people enter into a game, they're experiencing the game, they're entering into a liminal realm. And then they come out of the game. To what extent are they changed by their experience? With regard to your broader topic.
That's really a good question, and one that we're seeing a lot of struggle with, because on the one hand, you have so games with a purpose has emerged as kind of its own subfield of games and game design. Games that are kind of directed towards addressing some kind of social inequality or social injustice in the world. And something that has been studied in these is that play really becomes the driving force behind players' engagement with these games. And so they're able to pick up these games, and even if they understand what's going on and play the games, it soon turns into kind of like, how can I be an awful person in this game world? Or like, how can I start using this game to just kind of play around with it in general? And so we can use games to show designs, but that every game is going to accomplish, changing issues of hunger, or like even things like homophobia is fraught. Like this kind of goes back to the way that we engage in learning as well. Like some games are good for some people, and some people just might learn in other ways too. Games are kind of only one of the many tools that we might use to change somebody's mind or showcase issues to somebody. What's worth mentioning though is that games made to kind of foster a sense of empathy have been critiqued for allowing people to kind of consume identities of marginalized or underrepresented others, or from identities of backgrounds that they do not share. And so this kind of operates in ways where a player who does not reflect the identity of a person being shown may pick up a game, and then like after they're done playing it, they suddenly feel like they understand like the entire plight and history of the person. And so that's also like, not a good thing. So to answer your question, go back to the original question. I think we might be a little too hopeful of what games can accomplish. Or we might not be approaching our study of them correctly. Our study, not just of them, but the study of designing them correctly either. I think there's much more nuance to how we need to engage design and play to be reflective of social systems, but perhaps to ask that a game like be the only driving force that changes somebody's minds, I think is a bit of a big ask. To which I would actually question is, are we kind of unloading some of the duties of being compassionate and being understanding of each other onto algorithms, as opposed to doing this as humanists?
So I have a question. Do you think, or have you studied whether or not the platform makes a difference? I mean, like whether you're playing, say, a online game, on one hand you get the immersive experience, but if you're playing an RPG or tabletop, you get a different in-person experience that may be as narrative driven as the immersive online experience. Do you think that makes a difference in how people react to the games?
Yes, I haven't done extensive studies on this, but as a person who has made games, I have seen how this shapes the way that people play them as well. So for tabletop games, let me say that one of my dissertation chapters focused on drag bingo in the Chicago area. And what I was particularly interested in is how this group of co-located people engaged in different types of practices regarding gender and sexuality that are moderated through bingo. And what I saw happen was that people were more inclined to kind of also take on drag-like behaviors in this space and play with gender and sexuality. And really like reflect that, because you do have that co-located space, right? You're present in that space. And so you're more likely to discuss and engage in conversation. We also see this with like tabletop RPGs. LARPs are actually something that are being studied as ways of working through trauma, although I haven't done any research on that specifically. I know people are doing that research. But what's important to consider is that the medium the medium of the game will shape the experience that the player has. So even if we think like an online RPG will operate differently than a tabletop RPG, because then you're separated by screens. So while you still might be discussing, like, you're not actually in the presence of the other person.
Lindsay, I see that you're unmuted. Did you have a question or?
I was just going to make the comment. I have 3 middle school age boys and a husband. They're all big into gaming, be it Fortnite, World of Warcraft, Minecraft, Roblox, or Magic, or any of those kind of either face-to-face. And it is interesting when they are able to create their own avatar, the way that they interact and play in the game can definitely change. And I'm finding with that younger population of people, especially that elementary, middle school age, they don't have the same kind of hesitations to pick a different avatar and a different character. And I find that very enlightening. And one of my children, he flips back and forth and feels very comfortable picking different avatars. And they all, as a group, realize the person that they're playing with, that's the avatar the person picked. We have no idea their age or, you know, however they identify in the real world. But that part's nice to see that a fluidity that can happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's actually quite a lovely thing to see. I guess what I would like to see more of is that, you know, not only are we picking, you know, different appearances in games, but that the games might show us different perspectives, different life experiences as well. And so yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. That games also draw our attention to experiences that we might be unfamiliar with.
All right, we're coming up on noon. Does anybody else have any other observations or questions?
Yeah, thank you first, Michael, for your talk. I appreciated it. All this talk is reminding me of how reading literature like gives you the opportunity to you know, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, like depending on how it's narrated, and omniscient or first person, or, you know, and yeah, it's just making me think about the power of imagination and creativity, and also thinking just about the last comment Lindsay made about having had small children, you know, they're really playful, whether they're, you know, they try on different outfits. We had a whole, you know, dress up station. So it's very much like that. And as we, of course, get further socialized, it gets constricted. Another thought I had was wondering if anyone has played around with the whole microaggression thing in games, in terms of, when we talk about microaggressions in classrooms, oftentimes people express the desire to really know what's right or what's wrong, or what's, you know, what's going to offend somebody, what's not, you know, and how do you find that out, you know? And it just struck me that it would be really interesting to be a character who said something like, "Can I touch your hair?" You know, and like watch the reaction of different characters to that, you know? And so I don't know, that's just sort of a little out of left field, but those are the thoughts that your presentation made me think about. And I'm curious about your, you know, what you think about that. Talking with my hands is difficult.
So let me, I guess, reflect a little. One game that came to mind was this game that was trying to assess and teach people with kind of poor social skills, or like types of like social disabilities, what like proper responses are in certain situations. And to do this, they made this game called Awkward Annie, where you're in a group of people, and instead of having to pick like the right thing to say, you basically have to pick like a microaggression. So you're in every interaction, you're given 3 options. The first one is like the right thing to say, and then there's like a very bad option, and then your goal is to pick like the lesser bad option. And so the reason that the developers decided to do it this way was because if the players could assess which one the lesser of the 2 bad options were, that means that they would have to assess which one the good option was. And I think this game is still under beta testing, but I'm interested to see like if once it becomes released for play without restriction, if it turns into kind of this like game about playing around with microaggressions, where people are kind of laughing at like, let me be kind of a terrible person. The second study that I kind of want to point your attention to, Kashana Gray's work studies a lot of microaggressions in online gaming culture. So we'll not specifically focus on kind of characters' reactions to people doing microaggressions in games. She's interested in studying how I think particularly Black people engage in gameplay and navigate these social systems, especially when they encounter aggressive and hateful behavior online.
Yeah, I think we're all beginning to learn how effective gaming can be as an educational tool that can be applied to so many areas. So I really imagine it's going to grow and grow as the years go by, because these younger people who grew up so immersed in gaming are going to want to design all sorts of new games to address certain issues. So it should be fascinating to trace the evolution of gaming.
One of the jokes I've seen as everybody is quarantined is there's been a meme going around about how badly everyone did at Oregon Trail and we're all going to die.
Yeah, there's some good Oregon Trail t-shirts out there too. You know, you were bitten by a snake or
Died of dysentery.
Died of dysentery, right? That's always a favorite. Yeah, good point. Okay, well, we have pretty much reached our time. So I want to thank Mike again for sharing his interesting thoughts. As I said, you know, this is something we haven't talked about very much in the ideal cohort, is the idea of how gaming can be used. And so thanks for broadening our horizons here and giving us a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
If you have any further questions or want to bounce around ideas, my contact information is in my slides, or I don't want to maybe ask Paul, or you can get in touch with me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.